Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 13 of On Air. Today, we are doing our second reading with Kahn Selesnick, and they're joined by their lovely partners, Lauren and Sarah. And we're so excited to be celebrating your final day in residence officially with Lux through this reading and to get to share that with your partners. Before I hand it over to you guys, I want to give our community shout out, which is BTS Fresh, a new grocery store and ready bake meal delivery service. They're offering ready-baked family meals, fresh seasonal fruits and vegetables, all the essential grocery items, tons of great wine, and cleaning supplies delivered fresh to your doorstep. If you're looking for a fun way to celebrate Cinco de Mayo at home, BTS Fresh has put together tasty tacos and tequila meal deals. So check that out on their website, which we'll share with you. Now, I would love to pass it over to Richard and Nicholas and their partner, Sarah and Lauren.
Okay, I'm going to now attempt to share our screen.
There we go.
Okay.
So Lauren will read this, and this will be tiny.
Death of Actium. The air in the train was close and stuffy. Orlovsky had a catalog from the National Gallery in his lap, open to a reproduction of Titian's Death of Actium. In this painting, the goddess Diana shoots the naked trespasser with an arrow while he turns into a stag and is devoured by her hounds. In our bags were a pair of enormous antlers. We intended to attach these to Orlovsky's head and set him loose onto Exmoor. Across the aisle, I noticed that a rather handsome, statuesque woman seemed to be showing undue interest in Orlovsky's reading material. She asked if that was Titian's Actium. Orlovsky blushed and nodded. He often couldn't communicate verbally with strangers without recourse to grunts and barks. The woman got up, sat down across from us, and leaned in conspiratorially. "Did you know that I'm related to Actium?" This flirtatious remark was aimed pointedly at Orlovsky. I could almost feel the beads of sweat oozing from his pores. An unpleasant musk suddenly pervaded the air about us. She continued. She had been a normal, healthy child, but one morning, not long after the first bloods, she awoke in a sea of feathers, her pillow torn. Her head felt different, and reaching up, she felt two sharp protrusions growing from her skull. She had cried out, and her mother had rushed into the room. Taking her daughter's hands in hers, her mother had explained that she was not like other people. She was special. Her father had been a stag from the moorland. But hadn't Daddy run off to Australia with a poetess? "No, sweetheart," she said. Her mother told her that she would file down the little horns. It would be painful, but she would learn to manage. Her mother had then taken her by the hand and lifted it to her own scalp, and sure enough, she could feel small bony nubs, worn smooth by years under the rasp. Lastly, her mother had said that although she would have boyfriends when she was grown up, one day, many years from now, this was left in the air like a threat. After university, she moved to London to pursue the theater. Her mother had passed away, but she had kept their small cottage by the River Exe. One day, without being quite sure why, she stopped filing the horns. Within a week, she had grown a large set of antlers. These were accompanied by dark, unsettling urges. She had boarded a train for Somerset, her enormous horns on full display to the other passengers. "Do you know what it's like to be taken for a goddess?" she asked us, an almost wistful expression on her face. Orlovsky nodded vigorously, as if for all the world he'd been waiting for someone to ask him just this question. Absurd. When she arrived, she went out onto the moor. It was dusk and the deer were rutting. She heard a certain bark, and something had risen up in her throat, an orgasmic grunt, heavy and otherworldly. A response came back through the heady night air, and she returned to the cottage in a kind of trance. She knew, without knowing how, that she had arranged a rendezvous for the following evening where the woodland met the moors. The next day, twilight fell, and she went to the meeting place in her best dress. The horizon was the color of an orange rind, the zenith dark blue and starry. As she walked through the heather, Something struck her as wrong. There was a smell of death and excrement in the air. Near the wood's edge, she found him, her stag, lying in a pool of his own blood, a wound in his side, but still breathing. Their antlers had clacked as she threw her arms around his neck, her cold tears streaming down his reeking fur. Moments later, she heard the baying of the hounds and fled for her life, not stopping until she had locked the door of the cottage behind her. Since that day, she kept her horns filed down to the skull. For a moment, I feared she might take Orlovsky's sweaty paw and place it on her head. But instead, she finally introduced herself. Her name was Lulu, and she asked if she might accompany us on our expedition. Well, we would be delighted, I had said, but as she gathered her luggage and put it with our own, I noticed with unease what appeared to be the outline of an archer's bow in one of her bags.
Philia. And so it was, we plied our way around the venerable rustic county in an old car with a boot full of antiquated outfits and costumes, retracing the footsteps of the romantic poets. We followed the ancient watercourses, ate sandwiches on the banks of streams, and floated down overgrown canals, almost suffocated by the sheer abundance of the countryside. One afternoon, Lulu donned an old white dress and declared that we should stage a wedding. She would marry a man of flowers, a greenling covered from head to foot in blooms harvested from the hedgerows. It was unusual for her to succumb to such easy romanticism, so naturally I had been delighted. We immediately set to work, laughing gaily in the sunshine as we gathered wild cranesbill, poppies, tiger lilies, and whatever else we could find. After a spell, exhausted by our efforts, we had piled the blossoms beside a shady brook and lay down in the close air for some small sleep, while the insects hummed and slaved about us, their industry rebuilding the world anew while we snoozed. A while later, I felt a hint of dampness and awoke to find the small Leet had burst its banks. Orlovsky was dry, but Lulu was lying in several inches of water, incomprehensibly, impossibly still asleep. The floral mass had been lifted by the flood and was starting to float about her, drifting in the current. The air was scarcely breathable, full as it was of heady pollens and scents. Barely able to move in my intoxicated state, I stared at her and thought of John Everett Millet's Ophelia. He had posed the model, Elizabeth Siddal, in a porcelain bathtub in his house. But this was before the days of hot water tanks, and she became severely ill with pneumonia. Later, she married another Pre-Raphaelite, Dante Gabriel Rossetti. His erratic and abusive behavior had caused Siddal to succumb to addiction and anorexia, her health ruined by recourse to diluted arsenic used to improve her complexion. A stillborn daughter led to a postpartum depression and eventually suicide by laudanum overdose. Consumed with guilt, Rossetti had put a notebook containing his poems in the coffin to be buried with his wife. Years later, going blind from drug addiction, he became obsessed with retrieving these poems and tried to persuade the Home Secretary of the day that he should be allowed to have her grave exhumed. Eventually, his wish was granted and the coffin dug up in the dead of night to avoid scandal. Siddal's corpse was found to be in a remarkable state of preservation due to the large quantities of laudanum she had ingested. Critics ravaged the resultant volume on publication, and Rossetti suffered a nervous breakdown, dying several years later from an addiction to chloral nitrate. These details swirled about my head as I watched Lulu sleeping. I felt an almost visceral connection to the physical painting of Ophelia, as if it contained within it a life far more vivid than my own. I wondered why this appalling story should hold sway over me, yet as I lay there, the smell of Lulu's sweat and body flooding my senses, a part of me wanted nothing more than the melting down of the known universe by the heat of my ardor, the desire for every rotting thing to dissolve back into the marshy waters. Lulu's eyes opened and looked into mine. She invariably saw through me, but now her eyes had a kind of soft, knowing look, and she neither got up from the water nor expressed any surprise, instead continuing to lie there, peaceful, unmoving. Later, I sat in the back of the car with her while Orlovsky drove, and as we left the country behind for the city, the three of us each lost in our own thoughts, I felt her to be an enormous, undeniable presence, gradually blotting out the world and filling my field of vision with a febrile velvet gown of darkness, festooned with stars and comets, silent, silent.
Okay. This one's called a Green Crown. What happens when one has read too many books, seen too many films, sat in front of too many masterpieces, such that the meat of daily existence is rendered flavorless to a palate ruined by overindulgence in such delicious contrivances? When I looked out of the train window, I saw faceless suburban houses, a park, tangled expressways. But by the way his eyes had clouded over, I knew Orlovsky was seeing a separate reality, the hidden mythical landscape that lies tantalizingly just beyond the physical plane. As he traveled back in time, he saw dumps of slag and ash, aboriginal hunting rabbits and deer beneath umbrellas of cedar and pine, glaciers retreating and leaving sandy coves in their wake, and the sea, the infinite sea. Personally, I question the wisdom of such a journey. We were going in search of the beacons, a demolished Gothic fantasy on the Gold Coast. It was hard to say what we might find. Perhaps the ghost of a Jazz Age hamlet still wandering amid the ruins of his foe Elsinore, or more likely just the dreary remains of a solitary gatehouse or garden folly standing in forlorn lack of splendor in an anonymous second-growth forest. But, and this was important, it would make us feel something, even if it was merely revulsion at the tasteless excesses of the Gilded Age and at the banal world that had superseded it. The castle itself had been built during the Great War, as if the apocalypse abroad did not exist. Perhaps the occupants thought they might hide within it while the influenza pandemic raged beyond its walls. The owner, Miss Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, had built a string of such chateaus and had once given a masquerade ball costing in excess of $7 million. We had found ourselves haunted by the archtop photograph taken of her in costume, a dazzling array of white stuffed birds in her hands and at her feet. Each guest had a similar portrait taken by a prominent photographer of the day. Perhaps the most disturbing of these featured Miss Kate Puss Fearing Strong, who dressed as her nickname wore a taxidermied cat's head as a sort of headdress, accompanied by a large grouping of cat's tails sewn into her ball gown. This world had disappeared with extraordinary speed. By the end of World War II, the castle had been demolished, having stood for a mere 25 years. After disembarking from the train, we walked down a nondescript suburban street and quickly found what appeared to be an old gate to the estate. Beyond this, we entered a windswept forest of twisted trees, punctuated by occasional stonework of indeterminate age, bridges, stairs, and small tunnels that led towards the sound of the distant ocean. It was not long before this drowned out the sound of traffic, and I had the sudden feeling that we could be anywhere in the world or any time. The trees gave way to a large area of flowering scrubland with a sliver of ocean at the horizon. I realized with a start we were standing in the remains of what must have at one time been an enormous garden of hybrid tea roses that had returned to their common rootstock and rampaged through the formerly immaculate landscape. Orlovsky put down his bag and declared that it was here he would be crowned King of Weeds. As I performed this raggedy coronation, I could not help but think on the common origins of all our masquerades, when in millennia long gone by, we had gathered around the fire, a small circle of safety in a horrifying and hostile world, and dared to dance around it dressed in fur and leaves, hoping just as surely had Miss Puss Fearing Strong that the jealous gods might still intervene on our own behalves. And I wondered, would they still, or was it too late?
Paper birds. We were on the train to the West Country, dressed as bankers. This is not an uncommon state of affairs during this time. While the adoption of this uniform was intended to have a sort of stylishly ironic or subversive flavor to it, if I am truthful, I have to say on my part that there is also an element of wishful thinking and parental gratification in this choice. Orlovsky, of course, just looked ridiculous, a monkey dressed up for dinner. If this sounds harsh, it is not intended to be. He relished such incongruities and, in fact, cultivated them to an almost irritating degree. We had with us a suitcase full of banknotes that I'd carefully folded into paper airplanes. When we reached Land's End, we intended to launch them over the cliffs. This action was inspired by the misadventures of the Hungarian Pengu during the hyperinflation of 1946. During July of that year, the rate of inflation was 42 quadrillion%, the worst the world had ever seen. By the beginning of August, the total value of all Hungarian banknotes in circulation was less than 1/10 of a US cent. After currency reform, the streets of Budapest had been full of worthless quintillion pengu notes, and this had given rise to a curious incident. A wind shear in the eastern part of the city had lifted a mountain of banknotes gathered for burning into the upper atmosphere and delivered them over the Carpathian Mountains to Moldavia, where they rained down upon a remote mountain village. In some of the more inaccessible hermitages, local farmers, not knowing of the struggles in Hungary, thought they had become impossibly spontaneously rich. Pondering the phenomenon of unlikely objects falling from the sky, Orlovsky and I compared incidents we'd come across during our researches. He told me that growing up in Somerset, he'd read of an occurrence of jellyfish raining down from the skies above the spa town of Bath, causing a number of people to require treatments for stings, including one man who, upon looking upward as to ascertain the source of the falling animals, had one land on his face, swelling his eyes, rendering him temporarily blinded. This put me in mind of star jelly, which, according to folklore, is found in the vicinity of recent meteor strikes. The most famous incident of this occurred in Philadelphia in 1950, when two policemen discovered a quivering disc of jelly some 6 feet in diameter, a foot thick in the middle, and tapering perfectly to the thickness of an inch at the disc's extremities, which, upon handling, dissolved away to nothing. This incident formed the basis for the film The Blob. Orlovsky told me that he had heard of a man in Dorset who had found his garden full of blue balls of the substance after a meteor had landed in the nearby field. In the Victorian era, gentlemen scientists were quick to dismiss the notion that such jellies had celestial origins. Rather, frogs were put forth as the most likely source, as noted by Samuel Griswold in his 1848 work, Tales of the Moon and Stars. The quantity of jelly produced from one single frog is almost beyond belief, even to 5 or 6 times its bulk when in natural state, that is, when the frog is alive. Here we grew melancholy. It was raining outside, and the fields were flooded again. In fact, it was all over the news once more. Yet for all this water, every year there seemed to be fewer and fewer frogs, to be miraculously lifted by windstorms and deposited on our heads as a sure sign that the riders of the apocalypse were abroad somewhere. Now, we would just have to make do with banknotes.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories. I really, truly enjoyed, and it was so lovely to hear from Lauren and Sarah as well. You know, it's really nice to get to hear other voices that are so prominent within your work. They're heavily featured. And are they still with you guys?
Sarah's evacuated.
Okay. So maybe, Lord, I'm really curious, what is it like to be part of these worlds?
Well, I'm usually standing on the outside, and I don't like to watch Richard while he's you know, kind of making this work. I like to wait and be surprised in the end. I haven't even read the whole book yet because I like, you know, I don't want to, it seems almost invasive or it'll take some of the magic away. So I like to kind of be, you know, shocked at the end.
Even when you yourself are photographed, do you not necessarily know what part of the story you're involved in?
Not really, no. I just kind of, you know, I'm just sort of a prop.
Inspiration. That's
muse,
Yeah.
inspiration,
yes,
prop, you know, whatever.
Inspiration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love
So
that.
much more than just a prop.
Definitely.
Said the husband to his wife.
You know, at
Help
the very
create.
least, a wonderful storyteller. I think you told the story really beautifully. So.
Yeah. No, it was really nice to hear some other voices today.
Absolutely, yeah, completely.
Yeah, and the same for Sarah. Sorry that we missed her, but thank her as well for joining
I
us.
shall.
So, you know, I kind of to round up your residency, I am very curious to know what you ultimately thought of this platform.
It's been for sure somewhat difficult doing these things remotely, where you don't kind of you can't feed off the energy or of whoever you're giving a lecture to or reading to. But on the other hand, it's been amazing to have these connections that that we wouldn't have if we were just sitting in our houses, you know, not meeting new people and connecting with new people and talking about the work. So, you know,
Yeah.
kind of both ways.
Yeah, I got to know you guys a little bit when I visited Lux, and I have a better vision of what it might have been like to have been working there, which I maybe have more sadness and nostalgia for the fact that I wasn't able to do that. But the connections to you all it helps make it seem like we're all part of a family there, and I have known Andrew for like 15 years or so. So there is a long-term connection. So that's all been really nice, and getting to know you all as part of this. But it is, like Richard said, really odd, the platform of Zoom not getting the kind of face-to-face questions, the questions that come in whenever we've been chatting, without a person there and their eyes and the tone of reading a question to you. It does make it seem more lonely, perhaps, being on the one side of the screen in your own house, being part of it all. So it's definitely a mixed and strange experience.
Yeah, especially because I have a tendency to butcher reading questions out loud. So I'm sure.
No worries there. That's all been fine.
Yeah. But, you know, I think one of the really lovely things that this opportunity offered to us is to connect with some of the peoples that you've been working with, like Mara. And this upcoming week, we have a talk with Mark Adams, who will be talking more about mapping territories and how it relates to your work. And we also heard Mark talk during the curatorial panel discussion. And we had Letitia doing a tarot reading. So all of these opportunities and really connecting the different coasts. So that's been a really...
I'd say that's been one of the nicest things for us, is if we had have been just out there, it would have just been us. Whereas doing it this way, just by necessity, you guys have had to bring in other voices. And so that's really nice to get other perspectives on what we do.
Oh, yeah, that's been brilliant.
Just us talking about it all the time.
No, and I think, you know, this is teaching us really exciting ways that we know museums will have to innovate, right? And moving forward, this programming, even when we become back to, or when we get back to the physical spaces again, we want to keep these up because it's such a powerful way to connect to artists' work. And I truly enjoyed, you know, connecting with the people you're suggested so far. And I look forward to a whole more month of, you know, lovely awkwardness.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. But,
we're always happy to share our lovely awkwardness with you.
I want to really thank you guys so much for being in residence with us for this past month. It's been really nice, and I hope that we can connect in person after all of this craziness and, you know, celebrate in some other way when you guys come to the West Coast.
Yeah, we want to come out and see
Yeah.
your phosphorescent surf on your beaches
Yes. Well, it's
and
not,
make art there.
yeah, it only lasts for a couple of weeks, I hear, usually.
One day.
One day. It's very cool. But be safe when you go check it out and keep social distancing. And
Yes, certainly.
okay, well, thank you so much. Have a wonderful, wonderful Saturday. And, you know, it's been a joy having you in residence. And I look forward to connecting. And for everybody else, we have one more month of episodes related to Kahn Selesnick. Starting next week, we have, like I said, Mark Adams. We also have Robichaud Gallery. We're getting a tour from their Kahn Selesnick exhibition there, which will be really exciting. It's actually, the tour is narrated by Nicholas and Richard, and it's a really funny narration. I personally really enjoyed it. And then on Saturday, next week Saturday, we have a previously in AiR episode with Chacho and Ginone from Argentina. So if you want to see how they've been doing since they got rushed back during this crazy start of the pandemic. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Brilliant. Ciao.
Thank you. Bye.